he has
Well,
for the...
well, thank you. Let me just assure Mr. Massey that Speaker McCarthy, if I were Speaker McCarthy, I would still believe that this was the Speaker's committee, because from our vantage point, you haven't diverged from anything the Speaker has wanted up to this point. And so I think he's got the committee that he wants.
You should come in this room back here.
Yeah, well,
there's some divergence.
It's the votes that matter. Let me thank everybody for being here, and we're all talking about this deal in very abstract terms, and sometimes what I worry about is that we neglect to pay any attention to the fact that there are real people that get impacted by the decisions that are made here. I continue to be stunned by the fact that when I look at this deal, which focuses on discretionary funding, that the people who seem to be asked to do the most or to absorb the hits the most are the people that least can afford it. I mean, the military budget is part of this discretionary budget. It's over 50% of the discretionary budget. The United States spends more on national defense than China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and Ukraine combined. And yet, if this moves forward, we see an increase in defense spending. I mentioned it in my opening remarks. I don't know how many of you saw it. I mean, the 60 Minutes piece the other day. I mean, we all know of the cost overruns in the Department of Defense, and we know. I mean, the idea that we're spending $10,000 for a $300 oil switch. I mean, it's been there for a long time, and yet we seem unable to want to grapple with that waste and those cost overruns. I don't know if it's the defense lobbyists or the campaign contributions or whatever it is, but somehow when it comes to the military budget, not only are we not holding them accountable, but we say we're going to increase it even more. We'll give you more. And I say that because, again, when I look at some of the items that are contained in this so-called compromise, again, I worry about, as I said in my opening statement, I worry about the most vulnerable people in this country, the people on food assistance. And there are some things in here that I give the administration credit for helping to protect certain groups of people, people who are veterans, those who are graduating out of foster care, people who are unhoused. They're not subject to these new work requirements. And by the way, there's study after study after study that says these work requirements don't do what anybody says that they're supposed to do. It doesn't encourage work. It just makes people, poor people, poorer and hungrier. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a dear colleague letter that we sent out, a number of us sent out, that details those studies.
Without objection.
I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities entitled Debt Ceiling Agreement Reflects Improvements over House Bill, but Harmful Provisions Remain.
Without objection.
And one of the reasons why, in my opening statement, I made a big deal about the fact that there haven't been hearings held on what these new work requirements would do to people ages 50 to 54, was because I think sometimes we don't appreciate how complicated this population really is. Not everybody fits into a nice, neat category. And since this bill was announced, I'll give you some real-life examples, and if anybody wants to assure me that these people won't be adversely impacted, I would welcome that. But I heard from an individual who had back surgery and lost their job. This person can't work due to severe pain and is waiting to be approved for disability, over 50. Should that person lose access to SNAP benefits? Because under this proposal, I think there's a very real concern that that person would be. And by the way, that person may ultimately qualify for disability, but all of us who do disability casework know that that process can be long and arduous. But should that person lose the benefits? Or I have a mom who works part-time for under 20 hours per week as a teacher's aide. When her kids were younger, she needed flexibility to take care of them. Her kids are now older, they're no longer dependents, and she's now struggling to find a second job that has hours that allow her to continue working her primary job as a teacher's aide. She isn't getting a lot of responses to job applications, primarily because she's older and doesn't have the right skills. Does anybody think that that mom should, this working mom should lose her SNAP benefits? I mean, let me ask you another. These are real life stories. I mean, about the wife of a veteran who was having a hard time finding a job because she had hip replacement surgery a few years ago and continues to suffer quite a bit of pain. Under this bill, she would be at risk of losing her food benefit, which would impact the entire household's food budget, including the veteran. And since I don't know how many married couples who purchase, I don't know many married couples who purchase food separately, I mean, should this older adult whose husband served our country lose her contribution to the household's SNAP benefit? I mean, look, these are all real stories, real people who are harmed by the very dangerous policies that some of my friends here are pushing. People are going to fall through the cracks. And I just worry that we say things and we push forward stereotypes and we paint everything with one big broad brush, that sometimes we lose focus on the fact that there are people that don't fit into the nice, neat little categories that you have all established. There has not been one hearing on this population of people. And I know that because, as I said before, I serve on the Agriculture Committee and the subcommittee that oversees SNAP. Not one hearing. And I say not one hearing the last time the Republicans were in charge, and not one hearing this time either. And we know why that there's no hearing, because a hearing would uncover a lot of these complexities that people living in poverty in this country face. It would make, I think it would expose how out of touch some of my friends are who are advocating for these policies with the reality that exists. And again, I don't know what the savings are by going after this population. I will tell you this, there will be real costs down the road. I mean, people who go without food, who don't have access to nutritious food, end up getting sicker. They end up in emergency rooms. There are all kinds of, they end up developing chronic diseases that we end up having to deal with for a lifetime. So, I mean, it's not like you're saving money, but we are doubling down on people in this country, basically saying somehow that they're the problem, that's where the savings needs to come from, the people who are the most vulnerable people in our community. And again, it becomes even more difficult over 50. And it's harder to get a job when you're over 50. You may not have the skill set. Also, depending on where you live. If you live in a rural area that doesn't have public transportation, I represent communities in Massachusetts that are rural areas where there's no public transportation. You don't have a car. How do you get to a job training program? How do you get to, the job that we all expect you to take when the benefits and the salary are not, are not really much of anything. And so I don't know what anybody wants to comment, but it's like, we've made all these statements, we have all these new provisions, and none of us have done the due diligence to find out whether anybody will be adversely impacted. And I just don't know how we can feel comfortable moving forward when, we haven't even done a hearing on this stuff. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything, Mr. Thompson?
I do. You're absolutely correct in every point that you made. I just want to emphasize the fact that we're here on a compromise bill, and we can't lift people out of poverty, and we certainly can't make sure everybody has the food that they need if we allow economic apocalyptic outcome that we would see if we don't do this compromise. If we allow the economy to crash, nobody's going to get lifted out of poverty, and nobody's going to get anything to eat. This is a compromise bill. And we've all four of us, and all four of us came here to this committee to talk about that compromise and how important it is to avert an economic disaster. And that's what it does.
And I
But you're
appreciate,
spot on.
and I appreciate that, and we all want to avert an economic disaster. It just seems like, why do we have to avert an economic disaster by disproportionately burdening the most vulnerable? I mean, why can't we have a provision saying no more $10,000 oil switches for the Pentagon, or that we, or that we need a stronger audit of the Pentagon to make sure that we are not wasting all this money, on cost overruns, on things that contribute nothing to our national defense. And yet, I mean, we have expanded work requirements, which we know don't work, and we have done it to a population that is particularly vulnerable. And it's just kind of rotten that, the people who least can afford to bear the burden of this agreement are the people who do. Yeah, I mean, we should be able to solve this crisis, be able to lift the debt ceiling without increasing hunger in this country. We ought to be able to do it without making poor people poorer. We ought to be able to do it, without, I mean, these cases that these are real-life cases, and quite frankly, when this becomes the law of the land, these people are going to lose they're not going to get they lose their benefits. And I don't think any of us really want them to. I hope we don't. But that's kind of where we are. And so I appreciate, we'll see how all this plays out, but, look, everybody here wants to avoid a catastrophic default on our debt, But at some point, we have to stop going along to get along and allowing poor people and vulnerable people and people at risk always being the ones to say, okay, you're the ones who are going to take the hit. I just think that that's one of the most troubling things of this. And I praise President Biden. I praise his administration for being able to negotiate some of the concessions to protect some of these groups of people, the veterans, those graduating out of foster care, people who are unhoused. I think those are the least we can do. But I just worry in practice, we're going to see hunger increase in this country.
Ranking member?
Yes, I yield to the gentlelady.
One of the things that really is disturbing about what we're doing when we are trying to blame those who have fallen into a place of having hunger, and is that when you start cutting people out, we're not going to start putting them back on. So when we're in this point now where there's a certain sense of meanness, I mean, what you're pointing out when you think about the people you've talked to is that as the elected leaders, we are there's something that is distasteful because it feels mean. And sometimes it's really hard, and it's really hard to start saying that was wrong and to get these people back on so they're not hungry in America. I mean, thank you for raising the individual cases and what it looks like on the ground.
Yeah, I know, and Mr. Smith, one of my heroes was your predecessor, Bill Emerson, a Republican, who did an awful lot working with people like Tony Hall and others to try to combat hunger in this country. And I think, sometimes I think it's always amazing to me that given the number of people who are food insecure and hungry in this country, that it's not a bigger deal here in Congress. But let me just end by repeating what I said in my opening statement. Again, we don't hold the Defense Department accountable for cost overruns. We just, keep going. Yet we are doubling down on poor people. And, national security means more than the number of bombs and bullets we have. It means whether people have access to adequate nutrition. It means whether they have a roof over their head. It means whether or not their kids can get a decent education, whether they live in an environment that's not polluted, whether there's some hope for the future, they can retire with some sense of security. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. But I have no further comments. I thank the chairman for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you very